Right. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this sixth panel of the conference Geure Animalia. This panel brings together 4 papers that engage from different theoretical and historical perspectives with questions regarding non-human agency. What is especially interesting about this panel is how it moves across different periods and media as well. We have 19th century American literature, to contemporary science fiction, and also film, while consistently interrogating the boundaries between the human-animal, non-human animal. So across this session, we will see recurring concerns regarding posthumanism, pantheism, eco-criticism, and animal studies. So, as you may know, each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then we will leave time for the discussion at the end of all 4 papers. So let us begin with our first speaker, Richard Hardack. He holds a PhD in English and a JD from Berkeley and has published more than 50 articles. His first book, Not Altogether Human, Pantheism and the Dark Nature of the American Renaissance, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press, and currently Bloomsbury is reprinting Your Call is Very Important to Us, Advertising and the Corporate Theft of Personhood. And he is also the project editor of NASA's Juno mission to Jupiter. And he has come to present Think You There Is No Sensation in Being a Rock, Living with the Non-Human from Melville's Mardi to Pierre. So whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So my paper is going to focus on the 19th century, but my ultimate subject is the corporation, and I might not get to that by the end, so I want to just give you a very brief précis of why I mention that. The corporation was started as an instrument of colonialism and to facilitate slavery, but it was also the first form of artificial intelligence, and the ultimate teleology or goal of telos, trajectory of the corporation, is that it is antithetical to all forms of life. It wants to replace natural life with artificial life. And it is particularly antithetical to animals. And it's in a zero-sum game with life itself. So that when you talk about personhood or rights and discourses that ascribe them to people or to animals, the exact same discourse is being used to transfer them to corporations. In the US, less so in Europe, but to some degree in Europe, there's this fantasy and fiction that corporations are people, that they have the same rights or super rights as people, that they're fictions and animated beings. And that's important because the same discourse that's used to ascribe life and animation to the natural world through transcendentalism and pantheism, and as a romantic discourse, the very same rhetoric is used to justify giving personhood to corporations. So the same language that or logic that's used to say rivers have rights or mountains have rights and they have personhood, the very same discourse is used for corporations, and that's very disturbing. And that's ultimately, I think, what Melville is aware of. But I'm going to start with Melville's attitudes about nature and the natural world because they're surprisingly contemporary. So Herman Melville, probably most of you know through Moby Dick, realized that representations of animals and non-humans are also representations of personhood. That is a spectrum of what it means to be conscious and to have rights. In his 20s and 30s, Melville developed what we might call a form of extreme empathy, which I will label as pantheism, in which he identified in some way with all of existence. He had a completely anti-hierarchical view of the world. Everything was alive. Everything had the same sense of consciousness and feeling. On a picnic, just as an anecdote, at which Melville first met Nathaniel Hawthorne, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a poet, observed that Melville was a tree hugger and that he spent a lot of his time on the picnic patting trees on the back and talking to them. Someone else on the picnic observed this and thought that Melville was insane and should be committed because of it. Melville was an early believer in a form of what Jane Bennett calls vitalism, and he called pantheism or animism, a belief that all aspects of nature, the planet, and even inanimate objects were alive and had a form of consciousness. This is a notion that extends in American literature through writers such as Pynchon, Annie Dillard, and Toni Morrison in her novel Jazz. The sense that everything has some form of soul or life and could communicate with you if you only understood how to communicate with it. But Melville gradually realized his ascription of sentience to animals, trees, rocks, and even ships also extended to corporations. And he became very cynical about this. Of course, the word corporation itself means body, corp. And the irony is, of course, the corporation has no body. It's an invisible fiction. It's located nowhere. One of the first judges in England who talked about the idea of corporations said, corporations have no souls and no bodies to kick. And this idea has been kicking around for 500 years. People still talk about the idea of whether corporations can have a soul. Whether they have some inherent, which is a lot like AI, right? Can AI have a soul? Can it have sentience? Again, which is why AI is so much the necessary evolution of speech for a corporation. Corporation is a fiction, has no voice, but AI is its voice. I argue that the corporation is the opposite of an animal or a living thing, and it's emblematized, the corporation, by representations of robot dogs, bees, and so forth, artificial bodies to replace real ones. Going to give almost any episode of Black Mirror. For those of you who know Philip K. Dick, Blade Runner, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? One of the key elements of that novel is that all living animals have been replaced by corporate androids. And the goal of the corporation, in more films than you can remember, think of, Aliens and so on, is that the corporation takes over human reproduction, particularly obviously female reproduction, but it's very much targeting that. And that's, of course, is what happens in the real world. Monsanto patented genes, patenting life itself. Ultimately, the language used to give rights or personhood to the natural world became indistinguishable from the language courts used, starting in the 19th century, to say that corporations were imaginary beings with souls, consciousnesses, and rights, and super rights. In America, it's gotten so bizarre that corporations now have religious rights. A corporation can say, it believes in God and therefore can deny you contraception, but really bizarre things like that. So I'm arguing that Melville's initial drive, beginning in his 1849 novel Redburn, was to acknowledge and validate non-human life. This was a specific part of his pantheism, which many critics, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, based their entire philosophy on. And it's more familiar probably to many people through the idea of transcendentalism. Melville's fascination with the non-human world, and he personalizes everything in the world, including ships and rocks and so forth, comes to treat all life as equivalent. One that ultimately helps undermine his initially romantic attempts to universalize life. And just as a reference to help, many of you might not be familiar with Melville, but this is, I know it's playing fast and loose, but for those of you who've seen the Apple TV series Pluribus, the aliens in Pluribus are vegan pantheists. And they are sort of exactly what Melville was imagining, both satirizing and finding the dark side. And I particularly like Pluribus because, like Melville, it sees the idea of this extreme empathy with the world as both utopian and dystopian. The aliens in Pluribus have merged into one single planetary consciousness, which is what Melville talks about quite a bit. And they do not differentiate among any form of life, and they cannot harm anything, to the extent that they cannot even eat fruit unless it's already fallen from a tree. The dark joke in the series is that as a result, they quickly run out of food and have to start eating human bodies once they're dead, because ethically that makes sense. They're dead already; you can't harm them. But so the ultimate form of veganism in Pluribus is actually cannibalism. As with Melville, the question arises whether pantheism is or unlimited sympathy with the world is either plausible, but also what are the dark undersides? Why is there necessarily a corporate element to this? In Melville's novel Mardi, which was also 1849, and here's where I'll give you some examples. Babbalanja, who is a sort of substitute for Emerson, describes Mardi, which is the name of the entire planet. It's a living and sentient Gaia that could serve as a model for Pandora in the film Avatar. In fact, almost everything that you see about Avatar is true of Mardi. And here's a useful précis of Melville's ideas about non-human life. His character says, I live while consciousness is not mine, while to all appearances I am a clod. In other words, he's saying, I look like I'm asleep, but I'm still living. May not the same state of being, though, but alternate with me, be continually that of many dumb, passive objects we so carelessly regard. In other words, we look at the world and it's just asleep, the way people might think that I'm dead, but I'm really just asleep. Trust me, there are more things alive than those that crawl or fly or swim. Think you, my lord, there is no sensation in being a tree. Think you there is nothing to be a world. What are our tokens of animation? And animation is a key word here for life and for corporation. And think of it from Frankenstein. It's a whole discourse about non-living things. How do they become living? How do they become animated and move? That we move, make a noise, have organs, pulses, and are compounded of fluids and solid. All these are in Mardi, the planet, as a unit. Daily, the slow, majestic throbbing of its heart are perceptible on the surface in the tides of the lagoon. Its rivers are its veins. Think you there is no sensation in being a rock? So there are dozens and dozens of passages like this throughout the novel, where he's basically saying, if you look at the world, you're just not seeing that everything has some form of sentience. You just don't recognize it. As another character, Media adds, suffering is suffering. Be the sufferer man, brute, or thing. And I think the addition of that thing is important. It's not just the living world. It's everything. It's non-hierarchical and non-discriminatory. For Media, quote, Mardi is not wholly ours. We are the least populous part of creation. And what life is to us, sour or sweet, so it is to them. Like us, they die, fighting death to the last. Like us, they spawn and depart. We inhabit but a crust. So the litany is always, they are just like us. Many dialogues in Mardi conclude that life that we are normally aware of represents just a tiny percentage of the spectrum of existence. For Melville, however, America's economy was built not just on slavery, but a kind of deep-rooted cannibalism. And again, Melville does not differentiate among creatures. Every aspect of the literal and figurative social economy that Ishmael in Moby Dick addresses is in some way based on the exploitation of animals. For example, the disembodied whale, quote, for all his old age and one arm and one blind eye must die the death and be murdered in order to light the gay bridals and other merrymakings of men, and also to illuminate the solemn churches that preach unconditional offensiveness to all. In other words, these churches that preach love to all creatures are being lit by candles made out of dead whales and whale oil. Ishmael cannot justify, quote, that a man should eat a newly murdered thing of the sea, but eat it too by its own light. Ishmael implicitly compares such practices to infanticide and notes that he uses whale bookmarks. And this is, of course, rhetorically quite powerful. When he's reading his books, he's reading them with the skin of a whale. And he says that they're composed of the skin, so to speak. For it was simply ridiculous to say that the proper skin of this tremendous whale is thinner and more tender than the skin of a newborn child. But no more of this. Melville often uses that rhetorical device, no more of this. I can't go any further with this because it's too radical. But what he's basically saying is, how is it any different killing a whale to make bookmarks on the spectacles I read them from than killing a child? Why do we justify one and find the other abhorrent? Ishmael deflects his criticism at the reader, but will exonerate no one, including himself. Quote, go to the meat market and see the crowds of live bipeds staring up at the long rows of dead quadrupeds. Who is not a cannibal? Your knife handle, my civilized and enlightened gourmand dining off that roast beef. What is the handle made of? What but the bones of the brother of the very ox you are eating? Summarizing many of the above precepts, which are promulgated throughout both Mardi and Moby Dick, Babbalanja advances a radical ontological egalitarianism. Quote, in kings, mollusks, and toadstools, life is one and the same. He's very much channeling Emerson's notion of the principle of egalitarian life. In the sovereignty of ethics, for example, Emerson says, this self-help and self-creation proceed from the same power which works in the feeblest and meanest structures by the same design in a lobster or in a worm or in a man. Again, some of this was drawing on new ideas in natural science, but the idea basically was biologically there's no difference, and it's simply on a continuum. James Russell Lowell lambasted Emerson's Divinity School address for such dangerous taxonomies because Lowell would not, quote, hear the anointed Son of God made like themselves in animated clod. Animated clod is exactly the same language that Melville used. unfamiliar to us, but I think it was an important phrase because it basically meant anything could be animated. There's no difference between, we are just animated clods, animated pieces of dirt or dust. And this idea of animated dust comes back in many of these cases. 2 minutes? Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead because I want to give you a little bit of a taste of why I mentioned the corporation at the beginning. So I know I'm skipping around, but just to kind of tie this together. Melville becomes very cynical about pantheism because he realizes that many of the ideas are being used, in fact, to legitimate and bolster what was already the incipient corporation. And Moby Dick was very much a corporate enterprise. It was a corporate charter that went out to kill whales, and Melville very much set it up. And he describes the entire world and the American economy as corporate in all meridians. Melville most fully rejects this pantheist taxonomy when, in his novel after Moby Dick called Pierre, he eviscerates the body of one of pantheism's principal proponents, who is Goethe. This is a little bit dense, I know, but the passage is, "Thou inconceivable coxcomb of a Goethe, already the universe gets on without thee, and could spare 1,000,000 more of the identical kidney. Corporations have no souls, and thy pantheism, what was that? Thou wert but the pretentious, heartless part of a man." So here we see the direct link of pantheism, the idea that all things are alive and have the rights of persons, to the corporation that has been given personhood. And what Melville, I think, really fears the most is that this idea of nature is just a social construct. There is no such thing as nature in American life. It's kind of a safety valve. It's really just a subsidiary of the corporation. Nature belongs to the corporation, and he finds that a deeply depressing and terrifying idea. Many 19th and 20th century legal cases specify that the state animates or gives life to the corporation in language that directly echoes the transcendental inscription of nature's animation. And I can't go into all of it, but that really directly echoes Melville's language. This one is a little bit later because the early ones are a little convoluted. This is from the 70s, 1970s. "A corporation is a creature of the state. It owes its very being to the state. Into its nostrils," think of that, right? It's making the corporation a mammal. This is a judge speaking. "Into its nostrils, the state must breathe the breath of a fictitious life, or otherwise it would be no animated body, but individualistic dust." All of the corporate cases and literature is full of language like this, and it's just bizarre when you first encounter it. It's really strikingly disturbing. "Such cases appropriately treat the corporation as a Frankenstein monster, an animated thing of dust. Quote, while the directors are chosen by the stockholders, they become, when elected and properly organized as a board, the agent of the corporation. It is by such means that animate force is given to an inanimate thing." And again, you can kind of almost extrapolate this for yourselves to representations of corporations as villains in movies. The villain is the corporation, but there is no human being behind it. There are these toadies and these agents who speak for the corporation, but it's just this shadowy, amorphous mass that's out there doing malevolent things, usually trying to take control of nature. This language recalls that of Mardi in addressing the way people and things manifest agency and how they have artificial signs of life. But the reality is that corporations are no longer animated people, but the reverse. People are animated corporations. As corporations become people, people become corporations and they become things. And again, a little bit of a tangent, but the irony is that you now have to prove constantly to corporations on computers that you are a human being by identifying, security, and by identifying pictures and so forth. You're constantly being subjected to Turing tests to prove that you're human by algorithms and by computers. The rhetoric of these judges eerily and easily is co-opted by the recent tenets of vitalism, the conjecture that all matter has some form of life and identity, which can be used to attribute the traits of nature to corporations. And so I want to end there, but the disturbing thing for Melville, who was quite prophetic about this, and I think in a way anticipated much of this, is that the very precepts that are used to fight corporations are so easily co-opted by corporations because they're indistinguishable in many ways.
Well, join me in a big applause. Thank you so much.